The metallic clang of hospital machines echoed through the sterile room as I opened my eyes. The fluorescent lights burned into my retinas while 3 concerned doctors hovered over me, their faces a blur except for their expressions of confusion and alarm. My stomach felt like it had been scrubbed with steel wool from the inside, and the taste of charcoal lingered in my mouth from the emergency treatment. That's when Detective Rivera showed them the footage that would change everything. The video of my own sister methodically adding something to my food when she thought no one was watching. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That's impossible, Elizabeth whispered, her voice cracking with forced indignation when confronted with the evidence. The vial they found in her designer purse left a damning chemical signature that matched perfectly with the toxins they'd pumped from my system. I had waited 6 months for this moment. My name is Rachel, I'm 32 and a successful psychologist specializing in family trauma. This is the story of how I discovered my sister was slowly poisoning me after convincing everyone I was mentally unstable. The pristine walls of my downtown apartment had become my sanctuary and prison over the previous months. What started as occasional bouts of nausea and dizziness had escalated into debilitating symptoms that left me bedridden for days at a time. The doctors were baffled, running test after test, while my concerned family gathered around, their faces masks of worry that I now realize hid something far more sinister, at least in Elizabeth's case. "You've always been the fragile one," my sister would say, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy as she adjusted my pillows or brought me another homemade soup. "Remember when we were kids and you thought monsters lived under your bed?" The family would nod in agreement, recalling my childhood fears while overlooking Elizabeth's calculated campaign to cultivate those very anxieties by whispering terrifying stories after our parents had gone to bed. I'd built my career helping others heal from psychological wounds, while Elizabeth had crafted her image as the perfect daughter, the devoted sister, the successful interior designer whose clients included celebrities and tech billionaires. Somehow, in her mind, only one of us could truly thrive. My success threatened the narrative she'd constructed about her superiority and my inherent weakness. The symptoms began shortly after my private practice was featured in a prominent psychology magazine. Elizabeth had appeared at my door the next day with champagne and her signature mushroom risotto. "To celebrate my little sister finally getting some recognition," she'd said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Within hours, I was violently ill. The pattern would repeat. Every professional milestone coincided with a mysterious decline in my health. I found momentary respite in my best friend Margot's unwavering support when my mother appeared at my apartment door one afternoon, her expression strained beneath her impeccable makeup. "We're worried about you," she said, settling primly on my sofa. "Elizabeth thinks you might be working too hard. The stress is clearly affecting your health." Before I could protest, she continued, "She's arranged for you to see Dr. Whitman. He specializes in psychological disorders with physical manifestations." Despite my medical training and professional standing, I found myself being subtly maneuvered into questioning my own perceptions. "Your blood work shows nothing conclusive," doctors would say, their voices tinged with skepticism. "Have you considered that this might be psychosomatic?" Elizabeth would stand beside them, nodding sympathetically, her hand resting protectively on my shoulder. "We just want you to get better, Rach," she'd say, her voice honeyed with concern while her fingers dug painfully into my skin. The gaslighting was insidious and effective. Family dinners became showcases for Elizabeth's manipulation. "Rachel was just telling me she felt her apartment was bugged," she'd announce, earning concerned glances from our parents. "I never said that," I'd protest, only to have Elizabeth look at me with exaggerated pity. "Honey, you texted me about it at 3 a.m., don't you remember?" I hadn't, but the seed of doubt had been planted, not just in my family's minds, but in my own. My professional reputation began to suffer as whispers spread through our small community. Clients started canceling appointments. Colleagues called less frequently. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was always there, ready to drive me to doctors, appointments, prepare my meals, and report my concerning behavior to our increasingly worried parents. "I'm just looking out for my little sister," she'd tell them, her eyes wide with practiced innocence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The turning point came during a particularly bad episode that left me hospitalized. As I lay in the emergency room, drifting in and out of consciousness, I overheard Elizabeth speaking to the attending physician. "She's been under tremendous pressure," my sister explained, her voice low and confidential. "There was an incident last year with a patient that really shook her confidence. Since then, I've been worried she might be self-medicating." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I had never had an incident with a patient, nor had I ever abused medications. But in my weakened state, surrounded by medical professionals who were now eyeing me with suspicion rather than compassion, I felt utterly powerless to defend myself. The medication they administered to help me left me groggy and disoriented, further cementing the image of instability Elizabeth had carefully crafted. That night, as I drifted in and out of a medicated haze, a memory surfaced from our childhood, Elizabeth standing over my bed, a small jar of spiders in her hand. "If you tell Mom and Dad I took their car, I'll pour these into your sheets while you're sleeping," she'd whispered. I had kept her secret as I'd kept so many over the years, afraid of the consequences of crossing her. The memory crystallized something I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. My sister was not my protector. She was my tormentor. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. If Elizabeth was capable of such calculated cruelty as a teenager, what might she be capable of now, as an adult, with resources and a meticulously constructed facade of caring? The next morning, against medical advice, I checked myself out of the hospital. Instead of returning to my apartment, where Elizabeth had a key, I went to Margot's, the one person who had consistently expressed doubts about my sister's devoted caretaker act. "Something isn't right," I told Margot, my voice still weak but my resolve strengthening. "I'm not imagining this. I'm not having psychosomatic episodes. Something, or someone, is making me sick." To her credit, Margot didn't dismiss my fears. Instead, she asked the question that would ultimately save my life. "What if we set up cameras in your apartment?" The plan was simple but terrifying. I would return home, pretend to accept Elizabeth's help, and wait. Margot installed tiny cameras in my kitchen, living room, and even one disguised as a button on my bathrobe, places where Elizabeth might think herself unobserved. "If nothing happens, at least we'll know," Margot reassured me. "But if something does..." She left the sentence unfinished, neither of us willing to verbalize the horrifying possibility that my own sister might be poisoning me. For 2 weeks, I allowed Elizabeth back into my daily routine, accepting her offers to bring groceries, prepare meals, and even organize my medications. "The doctor says these will help with your anxiety," she'd say, handing me pills I obediently appeared to swallow but secretly disposed of. All the while, the cameras recorded silently, gathering evidence of what I prayed was just paranoid imagination. The footage, when Margot and I finally reviewed it together, was undeniable. There was Elizabeth in my kitchen, carefully adding a clear liquid from a small vial to the soup she was preparing. There she was again, sprinkling something into my tea that wasn't sugar. And most damning of all, there she was replacing the contents of my prescription anxiety medication with similar-looking pills from an unmarked container. "Oh my God," Margot whispered, her face pale with shock. "She's actually trying to kill you." The words hung in the air between us, too monstrous to fully comprehend. My own sister, the person who had stood beside me at our father's funeral, who had helped me move into my first apartment, who had seemingly supported my career while secretly undermining it at every turn. The evidence in hand, we went straight to the police. Detective Rivera listened with initial skepticism that quickly transformed into grim determination as he viewed the footage. "This is attempted murder," he stated flatly. "We'll need to test the substances, but this is more than enough for a warrant." The speed with which events unfolded after that was both a blessing and a curse. Officers were dispatched to apprehend Elizabeth, while others came to my apartment to collect samples from my food, medications, and even the houseplants she had gifted me. The toxicology results were shocking, even to the seasoned detectives. Elizabeth had been systematically exposing me to a combination of heavy metals, antifreeze, and prescription medications known to cause gradual organ failure, while mimicking the symptoms of anxiety and psychosomatic disorders. The amounts were carefully calibrated, enough to make me desperately ill, but not enough to kill me quickly. She wanted me to suffer, to doubt myself, to watch my career and relationships disintegrate before my body finally gave out. When confronted with the evidence, Elizabeth's carefully constructed mask cracked. "She's always been the favorite," she hissed at our stunned mother, who had been called to the police station. "Perfect Rachel, with her perfect grades and her perfect career helping people. Do you know what it's like living in her shadow? Everyone loves Rachel. Everyone believes Rachel. Poor, fragile Rachel, who somehow gets everything she wants." The hatred in her voice was palpable, a living thing that had apparently been growing inside her for decades. Our mother collapsed into a chair, unable to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the monster now revealed. "When did this start?" Detective Rivera asked, his voice calm but his eyes hard as he took notes. "The poisoning, I mean." Elizabeth's laugh was hollow, echoing in the sterile interrogation room. "Start? It never stopped. Do you remember your mysterious mono in college, Rach? The one that made you miss that prestigious internship? Or your food poisoning the night before your licensing exam? I've been managing you for years." Each revelation was another blow, forcing me to re-examine every illness, every setback, through the lens of my sister's malevolence. The district attorney filed charges for attempted murder, aggravated assault, and a host of related crimes. Elizabeth's initial bail hearing drew media attention, the sensational nature of sister-against-sister violence proving irresistible to reporters. The woman who appeared in court was unrecognizable to me. Gone was the polished, confident Elizabeth who had dominated family gatherings. In her place stood a hollow-eyed stranger in an orange jumpsuit, her manicured nails bitten to the quick. The recovery process was slow and painful, both physically and emotionally. Doctors confirmed that I had suffered liver and kidney damage from the prolonged poisoning, though with proper treatment they expected a full recovery. The psychological wounds proved more difficult to heal. How do you reconcile with the knowledge that someone who shares your blood, your childhood memories, your DNA, methodically tried to destroy you? My parents struggled with their own guilt and disbelief. "We should have seen it," my father said during one of his hospital visits, his face aged years in mere weeks. "All those times she volunteered to take care of you. We thought she was being a good sister." The revelation of Elizabeth's true nature forced a reckoning within our family, exposing the ways we had all enabled her manipulations, accepted her lies, and overlooked the red flags that, in retrospect, seemed blindingly obvious. Therapy became my lifeline, both as a practitioner and as a patient. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years helping others process trauma while being systematically traumatized by my own sister. My colleagues rallied around me as the truth emerged, offering support, coverage for my practice while I recovered, and a reminder that my professional identity remained intact despite Elizabeth's attempts to destroy it. 6 months after Elizabeth's arrest, I found myself back in the hospital, this time by choice. The doctors who had once regarded me with skepticism now treated me with a mixture of respect and remorse as they conducted the tests that would determine the extent of my recovery. "Your liver function is almost back to normal," Dr. Patel informed me, her smile genuine. "You're healing remarkably well, all things considered." All things considered. Such a simple phrase to encompass the horror of what had happened. As I left the hospital that day, I spotted a familiar figure waiting near the entrance. Margot, who had never doubted me, whose instincts had saved my life. "How'd it go?" she asked, linking her arm through mine as we walked to her car. "I'm going to be okay," I replied, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually believed it. The trial was still ahead, as was the long process of rebuilding my practice and my trust in others. But the fog of confusion and self-doubt that had clouded my mind for so long had finally lifted. My sister had poisoned my body, but she had failed to poison my spirit. Elizabeth was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison, with no possibility of parole, until she had served at least 10. The judge, in delivering the sentence, cited the quote, calculated, prolonged nature of the crimes and the profound breach of familial trust as aggravating factors. I sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read, watching Elizabeth's face for any sign of remorse. There was none, only a cold fury that sent chills down my spine. In the aftermath, I made the difficult decision to write a book about my experience, not for sensationalism, but as a resource for others who might be experiencing gaslighting and abuse from family members. The Poison of Trust became a bestseller, resonating with readers who had survived their own toxic relationships and prompting important conversations about the insidious nature of familial abuse. 3 years later, my practice has expanded to include a specialty in helping survivors of psychological manipulation and poisoning, a tragically underserved population. The cameras that once documented my sister's crimes have been replaced by security systems that give me peace of mind, allowing me to reclaim my home and my independence. The medications I now take are for healing, not harm. My relationship with my parents remains complicated. They alternate between overcompensating with concern and retreating in shame at their failure to protect me. Forgiveness is a process, not an event, and we are all learning to navigate this new reality, where one daughter is a convicted felon and the other bears the scars of her crimes. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I still find myself questioning food or drink placed before me, a reflexive vigilance that therapists tell me may never fully disappear. But these moments of fear no longer define me. What my sister failed to understand, in her twisted campaign to destroy me, is that surviving her betrayal has made me stronger, more compassionate, and more determined to help others find their way out of darkness. The most powerful lesson I've learned is that even when someone tries to rewrite your narrative, to cast you as unstable or untrustworthy, the truth has a weight and substance that fiction can never match. My sister told everyone I was delusional until cameras caught her poisoning my food. Now I tell my story not as a victim, but as a survivor whose voice can no longer be silenced. The hospital room felt like a fortress of solitude as I watched the toxicology report scroll across Dr. Patel's tablet. Each compound identified in my system told a story of calculated harm: arsenic, digitalis, prescription medications ground into fine powder, all delivered in carefully measured doses designed to debilitate without killing. "We've never seen a case quite like this," Dr. Patel admitted, her professional composure momentarily slipping to reveal genuine concern. "The methodical nature of the poisoning suggests premeditation that goes beyond impulse. Your sister knew exactly what she was doing." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The words hung in the sterile air between us, clinical yet devastating in their implications. Elizabeth hadn't just wanted to harm me, she had researched, planned, and executed a systematic campaign to destroy me from the inside out. The realization sent a chill through my weakened body that no hospital blanket could warm. Detective Rivera stood silently by the window, his weathered face unreadable as he took notes on Dr. Patel's assessment. "We'll need all of this documented for the prosecution," he said finally. "Every compound, every symptom, every timeline. The district attorney wants to build a case so airtight that even the best defense attorney can't find a crack." My mother sat rigid in the visitor's chair, her normally perfect posture now seeming more like a woman holding herself together through sheer will. The past 48 hours had aged her visibly, new lines etched around her eyes and mouth, her carefully highlighted hair suddenly seeming dull under the fluorescent lights. "I don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone in the room. "She's your sister. She held you when you were born. How could she?" Her voice broke, unable to complete the thought that none of us could fully comprehend. The question echoed in my mind as I drifted in and out of consciousness during those first days of recovery. How could the same hands that had braided my hair before school, that had held mine during our grandmother's funeral, also measure out poisons with such precision? Memory is a strange thing when trauma reshapes it. Suddenly, childhood incidents took on new, sinister meanings. The time I'd mysteriously fallen ill before a piano recital where we were both performing. The accidental spill of household cleaner that had burned my hands the week before a crucial swim meet. Had it always been happening, this calculated sabotage disguised as sisterly concern? Margot became my sentinel during hospital visiting hours, her normally easygoing demeanor transformed into fierce protectiveness. She scrutinized every nurse, questioned every medication, and kept a detailed log of everyone who entered my room. "Nobody gets near you without me knowing exactly who they are and what they're doing," she declared, setting up camp in the uncomfortable visitor's chair with her laptop and a determined expression. It was Margot who had first suggested the cameras. Margot who had believed me when everyone else, doctors, family, even colleagues, had begun to accept Elizabeth's carefully constructed narrative of my mental decline. The footage from those hidden cameras became central to both the criminal investigation and my own healing process. Detective Rivera had initially been reluctant to show me the complete recordings, concerned about the psychological impact. "You've been through enough trauma," he'd argued. But I insisted, needing to see with my own eyes what my sister had done when she thought herself unobserved. The clinical detachment I'd cultivated as a psychologist failed me completely as I watched Elizabeth methodically contaminate my food, replace my medications, and then, most chillingly, sit beside my bed with an expression of such tender concern that it would have fooled anyone. "She should have been an actress," Detective Rivera commented grimly as we reviewed a particularly disturbing clip where Elizabeth administered what she claimed was anti-nausea medication, but was actually a compound that would induce vomiting once I was alone. The level of performance here. Most killers can't maintain this kind of facade. I wanted to object to the term killer. Elizabeth hadn't actually succeeded in murdering me after all. But the words settled into my consciousness with terrible clarity. That had been the endgame, however patient and methodical the approach. The hospital became both sanctuary and prison during those weeks of recovery. The medical staff, now aware of what had happened, treated me with a mixture of clinical efficiency and poorly concealed horror. I became something of a medical curiosity, the woman whose sister had poisoned her with a pharmacological expertise that both impressed and disturbed the toxicologists. Specialists were brought in from neighboring hospitals, case studies were discussed, and through it all I felt increasingly like a specimen rather than a patient. Nights were the worst. Without the distraction of visitors or medical procedures, I found myself trapped in an endless loop of questions without answers. What moment in our shared history had tipped Elizabeth from sibling rivalry into murderous intent? Had there been signs I should have recognized? Could I have somehow prevented this by being less successful? Less visible? Less me? The psychiatrist assigned to my case? Drive? Levine, a compassionate woman with decades of experience, assured me that such questions were normal, but ultimately futile. "You're looking for logic in something fundamentally illogical," she explained during one of our sessions. "Your sister's actions reflect her pathology, not your worthiness as a person or a sister." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My father arrived from his business trip in Singapore 3 days after Elizabeth's arrest, his face ashen with shock and disbelief. He moved through the hospital room like a ghost, touching my hand briefly before retreating to the window to stare unseeing at the parking lot below. "I've hired the best criminal defense attorney in the state," he announced suddenly, his back still turned to me. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by my mother's sharp intake of breath. "For Elizabeth," he clarified, as if there had been any doubt. "This can't be as straightforward as it seems. There must be some explanation." The betrayal cut deeper than any poison. "Did you watch the footage?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see what she did to me?" He turned then, his expression a complex mixture of pain and denial. "I saw someone who might be very ill herself. Mental illness can stop." Margot's voice cut through his justifications like a blade. "Your daughter isn't the victim of mental illness. She's the victim of attempted murder. By your other daughter. Who, by the way, was completely lucid and methodical while doing it." My father flinched as if struck, but his need to find some explanation that didn't involve one daughter deliberately harming another remained palpable in the room. The family schism that followed was as predictable as it was painful. My parents, unable to reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the evidence before them, retreated into a state of complicated grief that manifested as alternating bouts of overprotectiveness toward me and desperate rationalizations of Elizabeth's behavior. Extended family members took sides, some rallying around me with casseroles and sympathy cards, others questioning the full story with barely concealed skepticism. The perfect family image that had been so important to my mother crumbled under the weight of police investigations, medical reports, and the inescapable reality of what Elizabeth had done. My professional identity became both shield and vulnerability during this period. As a psychologist specializing in family trauma, I possessed conceptual frameworks that helped me process what had happened, clinical language that provided emotional distance when the personal reality became too overwhelming. Yet that same professional standing had made me a target for Elizabeth's most insidious strategy, undermining my credibility by painting me as mentally unstable, using my own field's terminology against me. Paranoid ideation, she had told our concerned parents. Possibly exacerbated by burnout or compassion fatigue. The day I was finally cleared to leave the hospital coincided with Elizabeth's formal arraignment. I watched the proceedings on a tablet from my hospital bed, unable yet to face her in person, but unwilling to remain ignorant of the legal process that would determine her fate, and by extension, my safety. She appeared on screen in the standard-issue orange jumpsuit, her normally immaculate appearance disheveled in a way that struck me as calculated rather than genuine. Her attorney entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, a legal maneuver that sent whispers rippling through the courtroom and caused my heart to stutter with fresh anxiety. "It won't work," Detective Rivera assured me as he helped transport me from hospital to the safe house that had been arranged for my initial recovery. The level of planning, the efforts to conceal, the manipulation of others to isolate you, it all demonstrates clear awareness of wrongdoing. I wanted to believe him, but years of professional experience had taught me that courtrooms were theaters where narratives competed and the most compelling story often prevailed, regardless of underlying truth. Elizabeth had always been a masterful storyteller. The safe house was a modest ranch-style home on the outskirts of town, its location known only to a handful of law enforcement officers and Margot, who had taken a leave of absence from her job as a software engineer to help with my recovery. The property was equipped with security cameras, alarm systems, and a panic button that connected directly to the local police station. Overkill? Margot asked as she helped me settle into the spare bedroom that would be mine for the foreseeable future. I thought of Elizabeth's cold fury during the arraignment, the calculated way she had poisoned me over months, the psychological warfare she had waged so effectively that even I had begun to doubt my own perceptions. "No," I replied quietly. "Not overkill at all." Physical recovery progressed with agonizing slowness. The cocktail of toxins Elizabeth had administered had taken a toll on multiple organ systems, particularly my liver and kidneys. Dr. Patel had been cautiously optimistic about full recovery, but the reality involved daily medications, strict dietary restrictions, and a fatigue so profound it made even simple tasks like showering exhausting endeavors. "Your body is fighting its way back," Dr. Levine reminded me during our twice-weekly therapy sessions, which she conducted via secure video link to accommodate my limited mobility and security concerns. "And so is your mind. Be patient with both." Patience, however, was in short supply as the weeks stretched into months, and the legal proceedings against Elizabeth moved forward with the glacial pace typical of complex criminal cases. The prosecution's case built steadily, buttressed by the video evidence, toxicology reports, and damning testimony from Elizabeth's ex-boyfriend, who came forward with stories of her obsessive jealousy toward me and disturbing comments she had made about, quote, putting Rachel in her place. The defense, meanwhile, constructed an alternate narrative of Elizabeth as a devoted sister driven to psychological break by the pressure of caring for a successful but secretly troubled sibling. The media seized upon the story with predictable avidity. "Sibling rivalry turns deadly," declared one headline. "Sister versus sister, a psychological thriller comes to life," proclaimed another. Reporters camped outside the safe house until a restraining order forced them to maintain their distance, though the occasional drone still buzzed overhead, seeking photographs of the victim in her hiding place. My parents gave one disastrous interview in which my father's ambivalence about Elizabeth's guilt was painfully apparent, further fracturing our already strained relationship. 6 months into my recovery, with Elizabeth's trial date finally set, I made the decision to reclaim some semblance of my former life. The safe house, while necessary, had become another form of prison, a physical manifestation of the fear and isolation Elizabeth had sought to impose through her poisoning campaign. With Detective Rivera's reluctant blessing and Margot's unwavering support, I began the process of returning to my own apartment, now equipped with security systems that would have impressed a government facility. "Are you sure about this?" Margot asked as she helped me pack the few belongings I had accumulated during my stay in the safe house. "The trial is still months away. She still has supporters who think you're making this up for attention." I paused in the act of folding a sweater, considering her concern. The risk was real. Not just the physical danger from those who might wish to harm me on Elizabeth's behalf, but the psychological toll of returning to spaces where I had been systematically poisoned, where every cup of tea and home-cooked meal had been a potential vehicle for harm. "I'm not sure of anything anymore," I admitted, a rare moment of vulnerability even with Margot. "But I know I can't heal properly while hiding." Helping my patients taught me that recovery happens in the places where trauma occurred. I need to reclaim my space, my practice, my life. Margot's expression softened, and she squeezed my hand briefly before returning to the task of packing. "Then we'll make it happen, but I'm staying with you for the first week, and I'm testing every takeout container that comes through the door." The return to my apartment was both harder and easier than anticipated. The physical space had been thoroughly cleaned, with new furniture replacing items too contaminated by memory to keep. My kitchen had been completely renovated. New appliances, new dishes, new everything, a gift from my aunt who had never wavered in her support. Yet the emotional landscape remained fraught with landmines. The first time I made tea in my new kitchen, my hands shook so violently that hot water splashed across the counter. The simple act of taking medication, even medications prescribed for my recovery, triggered panic attacks that left me gasping for breath on the bathroom floor. Dr. Levine suggested we address these triggers head-on through a combination of cognitive behavioral techniques and carefully managed exposure therapy. "The goal isn't to forget what happened," she explained during one particularly difficult session. "It's to integrate it into your life narrative in a way that doesn't allow it to control your present." Easier said than done, but the methodical approach appealed to my clinical mind, offering a roadmap through terrain that felt impossibly treacherous. My decision to resume limited practice 3 weeks after returning to my apartment was met with mixed reactions. Colleagues expressed concern about burnout and re-traumatization. Friends worried that I was pushing too hard too soon. Only Dr. Levine seemed to truly understand. "Helping others heal can be profoundly restorative," she observed. "Just be mindful of your boundaries. You're still in recovery yourself." I selected 5 former patients whose issues felt manageable: grief, career transitions, relationship challenges, and scheduled them for once-weekly sessions in a newly secured office space across town from my apartment. The first session back was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. My patient, a middle-aged woman navigating the aftermath of divorce, seemed momentarily startled by my changed appearance, the weight loss and pallor that lingered despite my improving health, but quickly settled into our familiar therapeutic rhythm. For 50 minutes, I was Dr. Rachel again, not the victim, not the sister betrayed, not the subject of lurid headlines and courtroom speculation. The relief was so profound I wept in my car afterward, grateful tears that felt like the first genuine healing since Elizabeth's arrest. As the trial date approached, the prosecution requested a pre-trial meeting to prepare me for testifying. District Attorney Morales, a formidable woman with 20 years of experience prosecuting complex cases, did not mince words. "The defense will attack your credibility," she warned, her direct gaze holding mine across the conference table. "They'll suggest you imagined the poisoning due to underlying psychological issues, that the video evidence is misleading, that your professional training has made you paranoid rather than perceptive. They'll use your own expertise against you, Dr. Morrison. We need to be ready." The irony wasn't lost on me. After months of Elizabeth undermining my sanity, I would now face a formal legal attempt to declare me unreliable as a witness to my own poisoning. "What do you need from me?" I asked, determined to approach this challenge with the same clinical detachment I brought to my professional work. For the next 3 hours, DA Morales and her team subjected me to a brutal mock cross-examination, attacking everything from my recollection of symptoms to my professional ethics to my childhood relationship with Elizabeth. By the end, I was emotionally exhausted but steadier than I had been in months. If I could withstand this, I could withstand the actual trial. 2 weeks before the court date, the unexpected happened. My secure phone, the one known only to law enforcement, Margot, and my medical team, rang at 2 a.m. Detective Rivera's voice was tense when I answered. "Elizabeth has offered to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence," he said without preamble. 20 years instead of life, with the possibility of parole after 15. The DA wanted me to call you immediately. My mind raced through the implications. A plea would mean no trial, no public cross-examination, no opportunity for Elizabeth's defense to paint me as delusional. It would also mean no opportunity to confront my sister, to ask the questions that had haunted me through months of recovery. Why? When did you start hating me enough to do this? Was there ever a moment when you considered stopping? What happens if I say no? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady in the pre-dawn darkness. There was a pause on the line. "It's not entirely up to you," Rivera admitted. "The DA will consider your wishes, but ultimately it's her decision whether to accept the plea. She's concerned about the toll a trial would take on you, physically and emotionally. And she's concerned about the possibility, however small, of a not guilty verdict if Elizabeth's attorney successfully plants reasonable doubt about your reliability as a witness." The implication hung heavy in the silence that followed. Even now, even with video evidence and toxicology reports and expert testimony, there remained the possibility that Elizabeth's narrative, of me as unstable, paranoid, imagining threats, might prevail. I thought of the months of pain, the lingering health issues, the professional reputation I was still rebuilding. I thought of my parents, torn between daughters in an impossible choice. I thought of future clients who might hesitate to trust a therapist who had failed to recognize danger in her own home. Most of all, I thought of Elizabeth, not as she appeared in the videos, methodically poisoning me, but as she had been in childhood. My fierce protector against playground bullies, my confidant during our parents' brief separation, my sister. "Tell the DA I want to meet with Elizabeth before making a decision," I said finally, face to face. Rivera's sharp intake of breath conveyed his surprise and concern. "That's not standard procedure in cases like this. The risk is mine to take," I interrupted, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "I need to look her in the eye, Detective. I need to understand. Otherwise, none of this. The security systems, the new apartment, the therapy, none of it will truly protect me in the future." The detention center visiting room was a stark contrast to the elegant spaces where Elizabeth and I had previously shared our lives. Gone were the designer furnishings and ambient lighting, replaced by institutional furniture bolted to the floor and fluorescent lights that cast unflattering shadows across every surface. I sat at the metal table, hands folded to disguise their trembling, as Detective Rivera made final security checks. "We'll be monitoring everything," he assured me, adjusting the small panic button clipped to my collar. "One press, and we're in the room. Remember, she's restrained, but don't get within arm's reach. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The door on the opposite side of the room opened with a metallic clang that made me flinch despite my preparation. 2 corrections officers entered first, positioning themselves against the wall, their expressions professionally neutral. Then came Elizabeth. My breath caught at the sight of her, the prison jumpsuit hanging loose on her frame, her once immaculate hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face devoid of the makeup she had always applied with such precision. Only her eyes remained unchanged, that peculiar shade of green we had both inherited from our grandmother, now fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. 15 minutes. One of the officers announced as Elizabeth was guided to the chair across from me, her handcuffs secured to a ring embedded in the table. I had rehearsed this moment countless times in my mind, practiced opening lines with Dr. Levine, prepared myself for anger, denial, even threats. What I hadn't prepared for was the smile that spread across Elizabeth's face. Not the cold, calculating expression from the surveillance footage, but something almost genuine, tinged with what appeared to be relief. "You look better," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "The color's coming back to your face." The casual observation, as if we were meeting for our usual Sunday brunch, rather than in a detention center where she awaited trial for attempting to murder me, momentarily robbed me of speech. When I finally found my voice, the carefully prepared questions evaporated, replaced by the only one that truly mattered. "Why?" I asked, the single syllable carrying the weight of months of suffering and confusion. Elizabeth's eyes never left mine, her expression shifting subtly into something more calculated. "Would you believe me if I said I don't know?" "No," I replied honestly. "The videos show too much planning, too much deliberation." "This wasn't impulse, Elizabeth. This was systematic. You researched those compounds, you documented my symptoms. You manipulated everyone around us to isolate me. That doesn't happen without a why." She nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in my assessment. For a moment, I glimpsed the sister I had grown up with, the one who had always respected my intelligence, even when using it against me. "It started small," she said finally, her gaze drifting to the institutional clock on the wall. "After your feature in Psychology Today. Do you remember? Your practice exploded overnight. Suddenly you were the expert everyone wanted to consult, the rising star, the one with all the potential." Her voice remained conversational, as if discussing a minor professional jealousy rather than the origins of attempted murder. "I brought champagne to celebrate. I didn't plan to put anything in it. But then you started talking about the book deal they'd offered you and something just snapped. The admission hung between us, simultaneously mundane and monstrous. You poisoned me because I was successful?" I asked, unable to keep the incredulity from my voice. Elizabeth's expression hardened slightly. "I poisoned you because you had everything. Success, respect, purpose. Do you know what it's like living in the shadow of someone who makes everything look effortless? You breezed through school while I struggled for every B. You built a thriving practice while I hopped between design jobs that never quite fulfilled me. You have real, lasting relationships while I collect superficial connections that fall apart the moment they require actual vulnerability." The bitterness in her voice was palpable, a living thing that seemed to pulse in the sterile air between us. I thought of the carefully curated image Elizabeth had always projected. The glamorous sister with the enviable lifestyle, the wide social circle, the picture-perfect relationship with our parents. "You could have talked to me," I said softly. "If you were struggling, I would have helped you." Elizabeth's laugh was sharp enough to make one of the corrections officers shift his stance. "That's exactly the problem, Rachel. You're always ready to help, to fix, to counsel. Your compassion is just another way of highlighting my inadequacy." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The twisted logic of her resentment left me momentarily speechless. In Elizabeth's distorted worldview, even my most genuine offerings of support had been perceived as weapons. "So you decided to destroy me," I said finally, a statement rather than a question. Elizabeth's expression shifted again, something almost like regret flickering across her features. "Not at first. Initially, I just wanted to slow you down a little, make you doubt yourself. The way you'd sometimes made me doubt myself without even realizing it." "And then?" I prompted when she fell silent, staring at her restrained hands. "And then it felt good," she admitted, meeting my gaze directly for the first time since sitting down. "Having that power over you, watching everyone who had always seen you as the stable, successful one start to question your reliability. It became a kind of experiment. How far could I push before someone noticed? How completely could I dismantle the identity you'd built? The clinical detachment in her voice sent ice through my veins. She was describing psychological warfare with the dispassionate interest of a scientist observing a laboratory specimen. "You nearly killed me," I reminded her, my voice steady despite the nausea rising in my throat. "The last dose would have caused permanent kidney damage if Margot hadn't installed those cameras." Elizabeth nodded, neither confirming nor denying the ultimate intention behind her escalating poisoning campaign. "Margot was the variable I didn't account for," she said instead. "I'd successfully isolated you from everyone else. Our parents, your colleagues, even that barista you used to chat with every morning. But Margot refused to be manipulated." My thoughts turned to Margot, who had stood firm when everyone else had been swayed by Elizabeth's performance, who had suggested the cameras that eventually saved my life. "She saw through you," I said, unable to keep a hint of satisfaction from my voice. Elizabeth's expression tightened momentarily. She was never under my influence the way the others were. She didn't respond to the same techniques. I should have addressed that vulnerability in my approach. The way she spoke, analyzing her failures with the detached frustration of a strategist reviewing a flawed battle plan, chilled me more deeply than any display of rage or remorse might have. "The district attorney has offered you a plea deal," I said, abruptly changing the subject, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of seeing my distress. 20 years with possibility of parole after 15. She wanted my input before accepting or rejecting it. Elizabeth's eyebrows rose slightly, genuine surprise crossing her features. "And what did you tell her?" The question hung between us, weighted with unspoken implications. I studied my sister's face, the face I had known my entire life, now belonging to someone I no longer recognized. "I haven't decided yet," I admitted. "That's why I'm here." I needed to understand whether this was a momentary break from reality or if my sister has always been someone capable of calculating harm with such precision. Elizabeth held my gaze, something almost like respect flickering in her eyes. "And what have you concluded, Dr. Morrison? In your professional opinion, am I a psychopath who never truly cared for you, or just a deeply flawed human who lost her way?" The question was delivered with a hint of her old sardonic humor, but the tension underlying it was unmistakable. I thought of the hours spent reviewing childhood memories through the lens of this new knowledge, searching for early warning signs I might have missed. I thought of the sister who had held my hand at our grandmother's funeral, who had helped me move into my first apartment, who had celebrated my graduation from doctoral studies with seemingly genuine pride. Had it all been performance? Or had something broken along the way, transforming sisterly rivalry into deadly obsession? "I think," I said carefully, "that the answer matters less than what happens next." Elizabeth's expression shifted into something more guarded. "What happens next is fairly straightforward, isn't it? Either I accept the plea and spend the next 2 decades in prison, or I take my chances with a jury who might be swayed by my attorney's arguments about mental instability." Her clinical assessment of her options reminded me disturbingly of our father, who had always approached emotional situations with pragmatic detachment. "There's a third option," I said, the words emerging before I had fully formulated the thought behind them. "I'm listening," Elizabeth replied, curiosity evident in her slight forward lean, the maximum movement her restraints would allow. "The prosecution's case is built primarily on the video evidence and my testimony," I began, each word carefully chosen. "If I were to express doubt about your intentions, suggest that perhaps you were experiencing a psychiatric break rather than engaging in premeditated harm." I let the implication hang in the air between us. Elizabeth's eyes widened fractionally, the first genuine surprise I'd seen from her since she entered the room. "You would perjure yourself to help me?" she asked, disbelief coloring her tone. "After everything I did?" I met her gaze steadily, allowing her to see both the resolve and the pain behind my next words. "Not to help you. To help myself." Elizabeth's confusion was evident in the slight furrow between her brows. "I don't understand." "Of course you don't," I replied softly, "because you've never understood that healing isn't about punishment or vengeance. It's about reclaiming agency and finding a path forward that isn't defined by trauma." I leaned forward slightly, careful to maintain a safe distance. Here's my condition. Instead of prison, you enter a secure psychiatric facility. Not for a reduced sentence, but for comprehensive treatment. Real treatment, Elizabeth. Not the performance you're planning to give a jury about temporary insanity. Years of intensive therapy addressing the underlying issues that led you here. Her expression shifted from confusion to calculation, weighing the offer against her alternatives. And in return, you testify that you believe I was suffering from a psychotic break rather than acting with premeditation? No, I said firmly. I'll testify that I believe your actions reflect profound psychological disturbance requiring treatment rather than pure punitive measures. I won't lie about the facts, Elizabeth. The videos show what they show. But I will advocate for a sentence that includes mandatory psychiatric care. The distinction was crucial. I would not perjure myself or deny the reality of what had happened, but I could use my professional standing to influence how the court understood her actions. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed slightly. Why would you do this, after what I did to you? It was the first time she had directly acknowledged the harm she had caused, without deflection or rationalization. I considered her question carefully, aware that Detective Rivera and the corrections officers were listening to every word, that this conversation would likely be reviewed by the district attorney, and perhaps even referenced in court proceedings. Because I refused to let what you did define the rest of my life, I said finally. And part of that means making choices based on healing rather than harm. A complex emotion flickered across Elizabeth's face, something between resentment and reluctant respect. Always the better person? She murmured, but the usual edge of mockery was absent from her voice. No, I corrected her gently. Just a person trying to find a way through an impossible situation. The path I'm offering benefits us both, Elizabeth. You get treatment instead of warehousing. I get the chance to move forward, knowing I didn't perpetuate the cycle of harm. The pragmatism of my approach seemed to reach her in a way that appeals to emotion or morality might not have. What if I refuse? She asked, testing the boundaries of the offer. What if I take my chances with a jury? I met her gaze without flinching. Then I will testify truthfully about every symptom, every manipulation, every moment of terror, when I realized my own sister was systematically poisoning me. I will describe in clinical detail the psychological warfare you waged, isolating me from my support system and undermining my credibility. And I will do so not with anger or vengeance, but with the clear-eyed perspective of someone who has spent months processing this trauma with professional help. The subtle shift in Elizabeth's posture told me she understood the implicit threat. My testimony, delivered calmly, without apparent emotional bias, would be devastating to her defense strategy. And if I agree? She asked, her voice slightly less confident than before. Then I will still testify truthfully, I replied, but I will include my professional assessment that your actions, while methodical, reflect profound psychological disturbance, requiring specialized treatment. I will support a sentence that prioritizes rehabilitation alongside accountability. The distinction was subtle but significant. I was not offering to lie for her, but to advocate for an approach that might ultimately lead to genuine healing rather than mere punishment. Elizabeth was silent for several moments, weighing her options with the same calculating precision she had once applied to measuring toxins into my food. Finally, she looked up, her expression unreadable. I'll need to discuss this with my attorney. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm despite the enormity of what had just transpired. Of course, the offer stands until the plea deadline. As if on cue, one of the corrections officers stepped forward. Time's up. Elizabeth stood as they moved to escort her from the room, then paused, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Why did you really come here today, Rachel? What were you hoping to find? The question caught me off guard, its unexpected perceptiveness momentarily piercing the professional composure I had maintained throughout our conversation. Closure, maybe, I admitted, or at least understanding. Elizabeth's smile held a shadow of genuine sadness. And, did you find it? I considered the question as the officers waited impatiently by the door. Had I found what I was looking for in this sterile room, facing the sister who had tried to destroy me? Not closure, I said finally. I don't think that exists, not really. but I found something I can work with." Elizabeth nodded slightly, accepting the ambiguity of my answer. As the officers led her away, she glanced back once more. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not for what I did. I'm not that evolved yet, but for what it's cost you. That part was never the goal." The door closed behind her with a definitive clang, leaving me alone in the visiting room. Detective Rivera entered moments later, his expression reflecting the same stunned disbelief I had glimpsed on the faces of the corrections officers. "That was not what I expected," he admitted, helping me gather my belongings. "Are you really considering advocating for psychiatric treatment instead of prison?" I nodded, suddenly exhausted by the emotional toll of the encounter. "Not instead of consequences," I clarified, "but as part of them. What purpose does it serve anyone if she spends 20 years warehoused without addressing the issues that led her here?" Rivera shook his head slightly, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're a better person than most, Dr. Morrison. After what she put you through, many would want the harshest punishment possible." I thought of Elizabeth's face as she had admitted to poisoning me, the complex mixture of calculation, resentment, and something approaching regret. "Harshest isn't always most effective," I replied. "My professional training tells me that, and my personal experience confirms it." The weeks that followed brought a flurry of legal consultations, psychiatric evaluations, and difficult conversations with my parents, who struggled to reconcile their understanding of their daughters with the reality now confronting them. My father, initially resistant to the idea that Elizabeth had acted with deliberate malice, gradually came to accept the evidence before him. My mother, who had spent decades carefully cultivating our family's public image, found herself adrift in a situation no amount of social management could smooth over. "I don't understand how we got here," she confessed during a rare moment of vulnerability, sitting in my new apartment surrounded by the security measures that had become a necessary part of my life. "Where did we go wrong with her? With both of you?" The question reflected her tendency to assume responsibility for outcomes, as if better parenting might have prevented one daughter from trying to destroy the other. "This isn't about your parenting, Mom," I said gently. "Elizabeth made choices. Complex psychological factors influenced those choices, but they were still hers to make." Margot, unsurprisingly, was less diplomatic in her assessment. "You're actually considering advocating for her to get treatment instead of jail time?" she demanded when I shared my proposed approach. "After she systematically poisoned you for months? After she convinced your own parents you were having a mental breakdown?" Her protective outrage was both touching and reasonable. She had been the one to witness my suffering firsthand, the one who had installed the cameras that caught Elizabeth in the act, the one who had held my hair back during the worst of the poisoning symptoms. "I'm considering advocating for a sentence that includes mandatory psychiatric treatment alongside other consequences," I clarified. "Not as an act of forgiveness, Margot. As a practical approach to addressing the underlying issues that led her to this point." Margot's expression remained skeptical, but she knew me well enough to recognize when my mind was made up. "Just promise me you're doing this for the right reasons," she said finally. "Not out of some misplaced sense of sisterly obligation or professional responsibility to rehabilitate everyone, even those who harm you." Her concern touched on my own doubts, the questions I had explored in countless sessions with Dr. Levine. Was I advocating for Elizabeth's treatment out of genuine belief in rehabilitation, or was I still caught in patterns of family dynamics that prioritized her needs above my own? "I'm doing it for me," I assured Margot, finally certain of my motivation. "Because moving forward means making choices that align with my values, not reactions that perpetuate cycles of harm." Elizabeth ultimately accepted the modified plea deal, 15 years in a secure psychiatric facility, with regular evaluations to determine progress and potential for earlier supervised release. The agreement included strict monitoring provisions, restraining orders that would remain in effect even after her eventual release, and mandatory continuation of treatment as a condition of any future parole. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a path forward that acknowledged both the severity of her actions and the possibility, however remote, of genuine change. The day of the plea hearing arrived with unexpected clarity, both meteorological and emotional. The courthouse steps gleamed in the autumn sunshine as I made my way inside, accompanied by Margot and Dr. Levine, who had insisted on being present for support. My parents had chosen to attend separately, their own relationship strained by the divergent ways they had processed their daughter's trauma. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, intimate enough that when Elizabeth entered in her prison jumpsuit, our eyes met immediately across the space that separated us. She looked different. Thinner, certainly, but changed in ways beyond the physical. The careful mask of charm and confidence she had worn throughout our lives had been replaced by something more authentic, if not more comforting. When she rose to enter her plea, her voice was steady but subdued. "Guilty, Your Honor." Two words that acknowledged what months of evidence had already proven, yet hearing them spoken aloud in Elizabeth's voice sent an unexpected wave of emotion through me, not satisfaction or vindication, but a complex relief that the truth had finally been spoken between us. The judge's sentencing remarks were thoughtful and measured, acknowledging both the severity of Elizabeth's crimes and the unusual nature of the plea agreement. The court notes and appreciates Dr. Morrison's advocacy for treatment alongside accountability. Quote, he said, his gaze moving between us. It is a testament to extraordinary character to seek healing rather than mere punishment, particularly in a case involving such profound betrayal of trust. Elizabeth remained expressionless throughout most of the proceedings, but at these words she glanced in my direction, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her features. As the bailiffs prepared to escort her from the courtroom, Elizabeth turned fully toward me for the first time. No words were exchanged. None were necessary or perhaps even possible in that moment. What passed between us was simultaneously an ending and a beginning, a recognition that the sisters we had been to each other no longer existed, replaced by something more complex and uncertain. I did not smile or nod or offer any gesture of reconciliation. Instead, I simply held her gaze steadily, allowing her to see both my strength and my scars, before she was led away to begin her sentence. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered on the steps, hungry for statements about the sensational case that had captivated public attention for months. With Margot on one side and Dr. Levine on the other, I approached the microphones with the same steady composure I had maintained throughout the legal proceedings. "I have only a brief statement," I began, my voice carrying clearly in the crisp autumn air. "What happened to me was a profound betrayal by someone I trusted implicitly. The physical and emotional damage caused by my sister's actions will require ongoing healing. But today's resolution offers a path forward, not one based on vengeance, but on the possibility of genuine rehabilitation alongside appropriate consequences." A reporter called out from the crowd, "Do you forgive your sister for what she did to you?" Quote, the question hung in the air, its simplicity belying the complexity of emotion it sought to address. I considered my answer carefully, aware that my words would be broadcast and analyzed, potentially reaching others struggling with family trauma or betrayal. "Forgiveness isn't a destination you arrive at through sheer determination," I replied finally. "It's a process that unfolds differently for each person. What I can say with certainty is that I refuse to allow what happened to define the rest of my life or dictate my future choices. That's not forgiveness. It's reclaiming my own agency." 1 year later, I stood before a different kind of audience, a conference room filled with mental health professionals, law enforcement officers, and survivors of family violence. The lectern felt solid beneath my hands as I shared the story that had transformed both my personal life and my professional practice. When the person who poisons you is someone you love, the toxicity extends beyond the physical, I explained, scanning the attentive faces before me. It contaminates memories, undermines trust, and challenges your most fundamental understanding of safety and connection. My presentation, Beyond Betrayal: Psychological Recovery from Familial Harm, had grown from my own healing journey into a specialized therapeutic approach, now being implemented in treatment centers across the country. The techniques I had developed through necessity, rebuilding trust in incremental stages, establishing concrete safety measures as the foundation for emotional healing, integrating traumatic experiences without allowing them to become defining narratives, had proven effective for others navigating similar betrayals. Elizabeth remained in the secure psychiatric facility, her progress reports indicating genuine engagement with treatment alongside the manipulation attempts her therapists had anticipated and addressed. We had no direct contact. The restraining order and my own boundaries prevented it, but I received quarterly updates as stipulated in the plea agreement. Sometimes I studied the clinical language of these reports, searching for glimpses of the sister I had once known beneath the pathology that had driven her to such calculated harm. Other times, I filed them away unread, exercising the freedom to engage or disengage as my own healing required. My parents had finally begun their own therapy, confronting patterns of favoritism and emotional negligence that had contributed to the toxic dynamic between their daughters. Our relationship remained complicated but was slowly evolving into something more authentic, built on honest communication rather than appearance management. My father, in a particularly difficult session, had admitted to recognizing aspects of his own competitive nature in Elizabeth's pathological need to dominate. My mother had acknowledged how her different expectations for each daughter had fostered, rather than mitigated, our rivalry. Margot remained my steadfast friend, though she had finally returned to her own apartment once we were both satisfied with my security systems and recovery progress. Normal is overrated anyway, she had declared during our last roommate dinner, raising her glass in a toast to surviving the unimaginable and building something better on the other side. The sentiment had become something of a personal mantra during the darker moments of recovery, a reminder that healing wasn't about returning to a previous state, but about creating a new foundation that incorporated rather than denied the reality of what had happened. My professional practice had evolved to include a focus on familial betrayal and recovery, with a particular emphasis on rebuilding identity after gaslighting and psychological manipulation. The waiting list for my specialized services grew as word spread about my unique combination of professional expertise and personal experience. "You've turned poison into medicine," Dr. Levine observed during one of our now monthly consultation sessions. "Not just for yourself, but for others walking similar paths." The observation captured something essential about my journey. Not a neat narrative of victimhood transformed into triumph, but a complex process of integration, where traumatic experience became the foundation for deeper understanding rather than a wound that never healed. The sister who had tried to destroy me had inadvertently created circumstances that led to greater authenticity, purpose, and impact than I might otherwise have achieved, not because of her actions, but because of my response to them. As I concluded my presentation, a hand raised in the back of the conference room. "Given everything you experienced?" a young therapist asked. "Would you say you're fully healed now?" The question reflected our cultural hunger for neat resolution, for before and after stories with clearly defined endings. I smiled, appreciating both the sincerity of the inquiry and its fundamental misunderstanding of how profound trauma is integrated into a life. "Healing isn't a destination," I replied, echoing words Dr. Levine had once offered me. "It's a practice we engage with daily, sometimes hourly." There are still moments when I hesitate before eating food someone else has prepared, still nights when I wake from dreams of betrayal, still days when the weight of what happened feels heavier than others. But those experiences no longer define my life or limit my capacity for connection and purpose. That's not because the trauma has disappeared, but because I've built a life large enough to contain it without being consumed by it. As the audience applauded, I gathered my notes and stepped away from the lectern, ready for the networking reception that would follow. My phone buzzed with a text from Margot. "Killed it, I'm sure. Dinner after to celebrate?" I smiled, typing a quick confirmation before slipping the phone back into my pocket. Outside the conference center windows, the city stretched before me, vibrant and full of possibility. Not because the past had been erased or because justice had been perfectly served, but because I had chosen to move forward, step by step, day by day, creating a future defined by my own choices rather than by what had been done to me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.